welcome to Don't Know Much About, where it always starts with a question. Today, I'm very fortunate to invite filmmaker and fierce advocate for children, Natalya Murakhver. Natalya is co-founder of Restore Childhood, a national nonprofit dedicated to empowering parents and guiding their children's upbringing, education, and health. A longtime advocate for children's welfare, she spearheaded efforts against pandemic-era school closures, co-organizing Keep NYC Schools Open in 2020, and filing a lawsuit to reopen New York City schools for in-person learning. She launched the Mask Like a Kid campaign in 2021 and collaborated with global experts in 2022 to establish the urgency of normal, advocating for a return to pre-COVID childhood norms. Her directorial debut, 15 Days, The Real Story of the Pandemic School Closures, has been viewed more than 1 million times in an exclusive month-long run on X, and it's now being screened all around the country, galvanizing tons of parents to reclaim their agency in their children's education and health. Now, this coming Monday, the Manhattan Institute will be screening her film 15 Days. Be sure to register and grab your front row seats. I believe Natalya will be there to answer questions, so it's a real treat for people. So I'm extremely excited, honored to welcome Natalya to my show, Don't Know Much About. I'm going to just address kind of the elephant in the room before I do the official welcomes is it's been about 5.5 years since the schools have closed, and I understand that films take a long time to make. I guess I have two questions. One, why did you decide to make the film? And two, why is it still relevant today? And maybe what we will learn is that things aren't really back to normal. So, Natalia, why did you make this film and why is it still relevant 5.5 years after?
I made the film because I felt it was absolutely essential that we preserve the history as we experienced it, and we being the parents and the kids and the public health experts who spoke out against this huge tragedy that was totally avoidable and self-made really by the unions on children. So I knew that as I was living it and doing all those crazy things that you just talked about in your introduction, organizing, rallying, petitioning, trying to get schools open, suing the city. I knew that as soon as things went back to normal, whatever normal is now, the new normal, the unions and the people who tried to do this to us and keep our kids out of schools would try to have the authoritative view of what happened and would try to cover up the past, all the crimes, all the pain and the tragedies that we uncover. So that's why I made the film. It's totally relevant now in many ways. One, if we don't look at what happened, if we don't conduct a forensic examination, which is what I think our film is, it's an examination in our perspective. I mean, there are many different views, but this is what we believe happened. And by we, I mean myself and the other filmmakers I worked with, because this was definitely a collaborative effort. Eli Steele, who's a venerated film director and producer, documentarian, Hawk Jensen, Stephanie Edmonds. There was a very strong team working on this film, but we really felt that it was important to examine what happened so we could learn from the mistakes and, oh my God, maybe even hold somebody accountable. That definitely has not happened, but all of those things. And the inspiration for the film really was what Steven Spielberg did with the Shoah, and preserving the testimonies of the Holocaust survivors while they were still alive. I thought that was an incredible endeavor. If he didn't do it, nobody would have. And now we have these incredible testimonials of people who no longer are with us, and firsthand primary accounts of what happened. They can no longer be erased. I wanted to do that for the school closures because it was such an avoidable tragedy for so many children.
What do you mean by they're no longer with us?
Well, many of the Holocaust survivors are no longer with us because they died. They were old, and I think
But how,
Spielberg understood that. So he captured those stories before the elderly passed.
but are you saying, sorry, just to push back a little bit, are you saying that this is like the Holocaust? I mean, you're not saying this is like the Holocaust, what happened.
Well, of course not. Of course not. But those films and that move to capture those stories, kind of to create a what's the word for like
Repository?
what's that?
Like a repository, a memory.
Yeah, exactly. To capture. Okay, so let me backtrack. I lived in New York throughout 9/11, and it was incredibly traumatic. I was, just about 30 years old. I lived alone. It happened in Manhattan. I couldn't sleep for 6 months, and I just couldn't, process what it meant that something like that can happen to so many people, such horrible, horrible ways to die, and just this horrible act of terrorism. And so for 6 months, I, analyzed and thought about and talked about and read and did everything I could to just kind of to understand what was happening. But after those 6 months passed, I kind of memory hold everything, and I no longer wanted to have those conversations. And I felt that, excuse me. I, sorry, Manhattan apartments and small dogs that like to yap. But I felt that after 6 months had passed, I no longer wanted to ever talk about it again. It was like the wound had healed over. I processed it to the best of my ability, and I remember even traveling to California or other cities, and people would be like, "So 9/11," and I'd just be like, "No, I'm done. I'm not having this conversation. Not doing it for your benefit or anyone else's." And so I just wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to preserve those primary testimonies while they were fresh and raw, and while we had access to them, and while people felt like they could talk about their experiences honestly, and just kind of process them with us. So that's really what I meant. I obviously I don't compare it to the Holocaust, but there certainly were many tragedies for children, and the film actually is dedicated to a young man who suffered immensely during the pandemic school closures, and his mother tried to get him help. She was a psychiatrist. She did everything she could, and unfortunately, he still took his life in May of 2025. And his mother believes that it was absolutely due to the school closures and just how much his mental health deteriorated during that time.
Wow. I didn't realize that your film was dedicated to that. You let's go back a little bit. You said that the reason you wanted to make this film was twofold. One, you wanted there to have these testimonies. You wanted there to be like a repository or the event to be enshrined so that people can go back and look. And the second thing is you wanted a forensic investigation. You wanted to examine. So what did you find through
Well,
this film?
yeah. We found that at the beginning, everybody was really blindsided when school shut down. I think that the only fear that I and others around us had was of the virus. We were very, very concerned because the efficacy of the virus, the infection fatality rate, as the doctors call it, seemed very high, and the fear in the media was really being pushed at us, especially for those of us who were getting close to middle age and had husbands who were, close to 50, and living in crowded cities like New York City. And what we found is everybody we talked to pretty universally, it didn't matter that at that point it wasn't partisan, left, right, middle, apolitical. Everybody kind of had a universal experience at the very beginning. But as things dragged on, and as those 15 days extended into weeks, months, and in some cases years, because things still haven't gone back to normal, pretty early on, there were questions because it sure seemed like certain voices were being amplified. and certain voices were being silenced. For instance, the Great Barrington Declaration, which hopefully some of your audience knows by now. I certainly didn't know about it in October 2020 when it was introduced and signed by almost a million medical professionals from around the country. That was something that was written.
What is it?
So the Great Barrington Declaration was a small treatise. I think it was about a page long, very short, about focused protection, which was really the real pandemic playbook. It was kind of what Sweden, Norway, Denmark did, those countries that restored normalcy for the youth as quickly as possible. Some of them never really closed schools. Some of them closed schools for a few weeks or maybe, 2 months at the longest, but they all made decisions that prioritized the young and gave focused protection to the elderly, which is exactly the opposite of what we did in this country. So, Jay Bhattacharya, who was a researcher, a public health researcher at Stanford, had been called by Martin Kulldorff, who was a Harvard epidemiologist, and Sunetra Gupta, who was an epidemiologist, a world-renowned epidemiologist at Oxford. The three of them decided to come together and say, hey, hold on a second. Maybe we need to reconsider. Here are the real principles of focused protection. We need to reopen society as quickly as possible, specifically because the vulnerable cannot afford to be locked in their homes for this long. And the vulnerable definitely included children. And so they met in Great Barrington Declaration, sorry, they met in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, up in the Berkshires. That's why they called it the Great Barrington Declaration. And they had journalists and doctors and writers there. They all signed this declaration and they released it onto the internet. And it immediately took off. People realized this was common sense, and many reasonable people agreed that this was the proper way forward, not locking down society forever. However, Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, who at the time ran the National Institute of Infectious Diseases, the NIH, the CDC, they decided that this was not the way they wanted to proceed. And so now, in a Supreme Court case that was heard a few years ago, we've unearthed documents that said that they immediately contacted the social media companies and ordered a swift and devastating takedown of these doctors. They had them labeled fringe epidemiologists, which I think both of us will agree that epidemiologists from Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford are generally not fringe. And I don't actually know what a fringe epidemiologist is, but it is a nice way to slur someone. They had the social media companies black them out. So you couldn't really find the Great Barrington Declaration on Twitter, which is what it was at the time. Now it's X, or on Facebook or on Instagram, and then proceeded to instruct the schools to ostracize them. And Jay Bhattacharya is the one who we interviewed in this film. He talks about the fact that all he did was try to do the research and speak the truth and gather people together to restore society and preserve our values and our democracy. And he was getting death threats. So that's part of what we found out. The WHO, I think, it was a coordinated effort. There were many entities that were on the side of lockdowns. And for our purposes, because we're only really looking at schools, it was the teachers' unions.
We're going to talk about that in a second, but I want to go back to the who. Why would they be motivated to lock down schools? Why? Why would they want that?
Well, the simple answer is the answer that they would have given at the time was resources. They needed resources to change things. Resources means money. The teachers' unions were able to get $189.5 billion to reopen the schools. They got several different payouts through the CARES Act, the ESSER Act, and it totaled that we know of $189.5 billion within a few months. And that was triple the federal education budget for a single year. They got it in a few months. They claimed it was for PPE, for safety equipment. None of that stuff was necessary. Many of the school districts never even got any of that stuff. in our film, Randy Weingarten is very clear about, and she pretty much says this in the first few minutes, and it was in footage that we uncovered, that she was really seeing this pandemic as an opportunity to change society. I guess to her vision and to the progressive activists who were in that call with her, including Jane Fonda. They were trying to change society, and they knew that there was no better way to do that than by changing and reimagining, as they said, our schools.
Yeah, that moment in your film that you have that clip of Jane Fonda and Randy Weingarten, who, by the way, is like this. I call her the star of your film, but you corrected me and you said she's the anti-hero of your film. And I want to deal with her separately. But that clip that you have in your film, where they're basically admitting to themselves privately, like, we're sitting on an amazing opportunity. We have to take this opportunity to get what we want politically, right? To get what we want in terms of our activism. And I want to talk about what is it that they want. I want to go there. I want to understand why, what did they want? And do you think they succeeded?
I think they were very successful. I don't think they're done. Well, time will tell if they succeeded. I think if you and I have anything to say about it, they will not. But in the short term, they succeeded, yes. Um, there's a part in our
Were they
film.
able, were they able, well, you know more than I do about this, so I'm really deferring to your knowledge. But like, were they able to, as a result of closing schools, getting more money, were they able to, let's say, create dangerous curriculum that excused tyranny, let's say? What kind of things were they able to get done?
I mean,
Is
all of the social emotional learning curriculum that they pushed into schools, um, all the counselors, the therapists. I mean, you're aware of how where the mental health care workers lie in all of this, right? It's all like this victimizer mentality. They're not really helping our children. There's more mental health issues now than there ever was. So what they did was they created a crisis and said, "Oh my God, we have a solution. There's a crisis. It's not our fault as a virus. Like we're just reacting to the virus. We're doing the best we can. Oh, and the solution is hire more workers who are going to pay more union dues." Isn't that brilliant? It's awesome. They also have pushed community schools. Community schools sound so great. They always have the best language. I love their language. Community schools are schools that have the education or indoctrination center that the kids go to, whatever you want to call it, and also a medical center right on, on premises. So what they're trying to do is decentralize the home, decentralize the parent and say to the parents, hey guys, you're busy. You don't have time to take your child to the doctor. But you know what? We got the doctor right there. We'll take care of your child. Mental health issues, we'll give them medication. Gender identity questions, we'll help them be the person that they think they are. So it's all, it's all a process. And I do believe that they've been incredibly successful. The agenda, Randy Weingarten said it in a different clip that we used in the film. And by the way, this was a clip that we found in many different iterations. She's very open about it. She says, justice is our middle name. It is the lens through which we do everything. Racial justice, their version of racial justice, is gender justice, is social justice, is environmental justice. It's the same thing. It's the lens through which we do everything.
yes, I again, you know this much better than I do, but I too was very concerned and continue to be concerned about the role that social emotional learning is having in schools. And my background is in studying anti-Jewish movements, as you know, but also the ideologies that bolster these anti-Jewish movements, whether we're talking about anti-Semitism or today's anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism was created by the Soviet Union in many ways, and the Soviet Union is a far leftist state. Now, what concerns me about social emotional learning, in addition to everything else you're saying, which is that it replaces family with state. The state is now the family. And by the way, I used to study the Soviet Union and Lenin's kind of the assembly line of creating the state. And one of the things that he did brilliantly was basically teach the population that the state effectively will be your surrogate parent.
Mhm.
And that's what happened in the Soviet Union. That's where you have stories like Pavlik Morozov. Pavlik Morozov is a national hero in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. He betrayed his father for being a kulak, which was a rich peasant who was basically resistant to the state collectivization campaign. He betrays his father and is hailed a hero by the Soviet Union. And in many, many poems and many, many, praising messages in the Soviet Union, Pavlik Morozov basically admit, denounced father and accepted state as father. And so that to me is always really frightening. But bringing it back to social emotional learning and anti-Zionism and grievance narratives, what I'm hearing from, I work with parents in New York City who are facing anti-Zionism in their schools, what I'm hearing is in their now it's mandatory in schools to have sessions where you basically have grievance sessions,
Mhm.
where you sit and you have a grievance therapy session. And lo and behold, in almost every one of those grievance sessions, you'll have a question such as centering Palestine. Palestine becomes the oppressor. I'm sorry, the oppressed. Palestine is the oppressed. And how are you feeling oppressed today? How is the system? Yeah, it's brilliant, really.
Yes.
And it really frightens me. So what you're saying basically is that these that they demanded these school closures. They wanted to use them for political efficacy, for to do things such as bring in social emotional learning, because through social emotional learning, they can erode the family unit,
Yep.
tradition, and they could basically get to the children. It's another way of getting through children without being in the classroom. And it's actually much more, I would say, effective because classroom instruction is, it's classroom, but here there's this, it's almost a therapy session that these kids are having. Let's talk about Randy Weingarten for a second. Tell me why she is an important figure for us to understand. Tell me about her, and I'll tell you about her from my perspective, which is over under her oversight, school curriculum basically institutionalized anti-Zionism.
Yeah.
So
I
what
mean,
about, yeah,
she's a, I mean, I think she's a communist, right? I mean, she
perhaps
and
she is.
um but I mean, I had no idea who she was up until like 2020, 2021. And in fact, I heard that from other school board leaders who had said, like when parents were advocating to reopen schools and they were getting really angry at the teachers unions because they understood that the teachers unions were the impediment. And in fact, in cities and states where the unions were not as powerful, like Florida, schools reopened much more quickly and kids went back to normal. And so when parents understood that, they got very upset with the unions and they said, "Oh, well, what's going on with the unions?" And a school board leader here in New York City that I spoke with said, "It's weird." He's like, I've served on this school board for 6 years, and parents never even mentioned the union once. They weren't even aware of what the union was doing or that it existed." And now everybody's really angry at the unions. So yeah, it was just an interesting thing. Randy Weingarten has many faces. She's incredibly Machiavellian. If you watch the film and you watch her character transformation, she can play many different roles. She seems extraordinarily empathic when she says, the epidemiologists have told us that we have to close schools. She never takes responsibility. So in her role, she never ever takes responsibility for the action. She only is the messenger of what the experts have said. So in the case of closing schools, she understands, she's empathic. There's nothing she can do. It was the epidemiologists. When it's time to keep the schools closed, there's nothing she can do. It's the teachers who are afraid to go back to school, and it's the Black and Brown community. But let's look behind the scenes here. In March 2020, and probably before that, we found video from March 2020 from a Zoom call that all these NGOs had together with Randy and with Jane Fonda, where they were trying to figure out how to use this crisis to change the administration. This was the Trump administration. They wanted him out. They also saw an opportunity for a lot of money to progress their social and climate justice agendas. They all had just slightly different versions of what they, were looking for, but it was all pretty much the same thing, as Randy said. And Randy, strangely, in March 2020, in this call when we were all still sterilizing our groceries, said, again, this is March 2020, during the first 2 weeks of Slow the Spread. She said, we need to figure out what we're going to do with this pandemic that's going to change our lives fundamentally in America. I don't know. Did you know in March 2020 that your life was going to be changed fundamentally? I had no idea. I mean, I was in the moment. Like I was like, okay, let's stay home, let's stay safe. Let's try to get some masks when we go to the grocery store and let's hope these 50. So they were saying 15 days to slow the spread, but Randy knew that it was never going to be 15 days. She knew that she was going to use this and she was going to make an epic out of it, and she did it. She did.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a tough question. What are you really saying then? Are you saying she had some sort of knowledge to something? What are you trying to say
I,
then?
I don't know. I can't say what I don't know. I just know that she saw an opportunity. They all saw an opportunity. What they knew before, what Fauci did, I think it's hard for me not to consider him a war criminal. He's never been tried. I think Biden pardoned him, whatever, fine. I mean, he's old, it's over, fine. Other people don't feel the same way. But Fauci to me is just one character in this story. What Randy Weingarten did was say, you know what? The children don't matter. The parents are the enemy. The teachers don't matter, because the shutdowns did not benefit the teachers. When people say, oh, she shut down the schools because she was trying to keep the teachers safe. No, 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 no. The teachers were always safe. And you know what? There was a messenger who was in the White House, Scott Atlas, who was a Stanford radiologist, who was swiftly taken down by the establishment. I mean, the worst. He got it the worst out of everyone. He had done the research, he had seen. He said this is an age stratified disease. Teaching is the youngest profession. If anything, the teachers are the safest profession. Why aren't they in the classrooms? They need to be there with their children. And Randy Weingarten saw an opportunity. I don't know what she knew or didn't know before. That's another exploration that I think should be done. But she saw an opportunity that there was a time now where everybody was scared. She could give the teachers their talking points and load them up on fear. She saw the Black and brown community. She used them as pawns and said, you know what? Your kid, I want to keep your kids safe, but they're not safe in schools. And you know what? Everybody wants to kill your kids. So you better speak up, because otherwise your kids are going to die in those schools. Well, gosh, I mean, who knows, like in the time of crisis, how that is a lot to process. So she had messengers on both sides. And then she said, well, I don't want to keep the schools closed. The teachers are afraid to go back, and the Black and brown communities are afraid to go back. I'm just the messenger. There's nothing I can do about it. So I don't know. What do you call a person like that?
I think an opportunist and a manipulator and dangerous. Let's put it this way,
Very
dangerous.
dangerous. Very
Right.
charming, very dangerous, very capable and comfortable wearing all the different faces that she wore. And I got to meet her, so I got to see one of them up close. And she's a very charming, lovely person, very, very smart and lovely to have a conversation with if you don't know everything else.
Right. I mean, from my area of interest and expertise, her name comes up in a different context, not necessarily the role that she's played or had played with school closures, but rather the role that she plays in providing a legitimacy for anti-Zionist curriculum to enter
Yeah.
K through 12 schools. And
Yep.
that I want to just read something that I came across today. Um, when she was the president of the AFT, um, she issued the following statement
She is
after,
the president of the AFT. She used to be the president of the UFT, which is the New York City
right,
branch of the AFT, but she is the president of the
of the
AFT
American, okay, Foundation for Teachers, right?
at the
Okay,
national. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So she issued the following statement in October of 2024 on the on the death or of Yahya Sinwar, one of the masterminds behind October 7th. And I'm just going to read that out loud because I think it's just so indicative of the what you're talking about of the many faces that she wears.
Yep.
What she says, the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who was the mastermind behind the horrendous attack on Israel, is good news, indeed a great relief, and it should also be a catalyst to a significant shift in the region. This war must end. There is still a never-ending urgency to bring home hostages. Israel must re-enter negotiations. With Sinwar's death must come a hostage deal and a ceasefire. There's a tremendous humanitarian crisis in Gaza that Israel must take serious. More than a year after the Hamas attacks, it's urgent for Palestinians and Israelis alike to move forward. Now, on the face of it, it's it's very diplomatic. Um, it's telling, I always say to my students, it's not what exists, but also what doesn't exist.
Mhm.
Here, I'm going to actually talk about what does exist. She could have made a statement that said, it's we commend Israel's actions in killing the mastermind, period. But she
Mhm.
used that as an opportunity to opine about the conflict as if she has any knowledge, giving, but what she's doing by giving such a statement in the role of president of the AFT, she's basically signaling that this is something that we are going to be doing. We are going to be talking about this in our schools. We are going to be promoting curriculum about the Israeli-Palestinian or Arab-Israeli conflict. And moreover, she's using this to talk about ending the war, ending the war, ending the war. And obviously, everybody wants to end the war, but not in a foolish, stupid way where Hamas still exists. She doesn't even mention Hamas. Yes, it's nice that Sinwar was killed. Thank you very much. And now let's end the war.
Mhm.
The fact
It's
that in her role as president of teachers, of the Union of Teachers, why is she making this statement? And what is she signaling by making such a statement? So, from my perspective, she's a very dangerous person because you could see in that statement that I read, she's, at least she's saying that it's good that Sinwar was killed. But she's using that to then make another statement about how there should be a ceasefire, an end to war, that what's happening in Gaza is a humanitarian crisis.
Mhm.
But doesn't it all talk about Hamas? That there's a humanitarian crisis because of Hamas. So under her watch, so many Jewish parents go to the Lawfare Project, the Deborah Project, different lawfare organizations trying to file lawsuits in public schools. We're talking about public schools right now that have brought in very dangerous curriculum that effectively put a target on Jewish students because of this type of rhetoric. And so, this film, which I've seen already twice, and I think it's this is what I was going to tell you. I think that in many ways, yes, this is a film that documents um, the school closure, but I think the film is much more than that. I think this film documents the dangers of totalitarianism, the dangers of a tyranny when an ideology can become tyrannical. That's the danger. And it's un-American. Effectively, it's un-American. What happened is an un-American story. And that's what you're documenting, really, is a story where in the United States of America, the cartel, which is the teachers union, headed by Randy Weingarten, got away with crimes really effectively. That's why I think that in addition to, as you say, dedicating this to the children and the harm that it did to children, I think it also did a lot of harm to America. What are your thoughts about? I
I
mean,
think that's an incredible way of putting it. You're very good at summing this up in a through a different lens. Yes, that's exactly right. And maybe that's why I had such an adverse reaction to the school closures. I think when I realized that there was no evidence I could present, no good faith negotiations to get a seat at the table, there was nothing I could do to reopen schools. It didn't matter if I had all the data on my side. Jay Bhattacharya realized that too. He thought, hey, I'm just going to do some research on the infection fatality rate and then report it. And people like, Monica Gandhi said, this has never happened before in the history of this country, even during the Spanish flu, when it was so virulent and so dangerous to children. Truly progressive cities like New York City, Philadelphia, New Haven, Connecticut, they all reopened schools because they realized how important it was to keep these children, fed and alive and safe from abuse and, low income, low socioeconomic homes where there were no resources. But yeah, I mean, I think that I realized that, and we all realized that there was nothing we could do in good faith that would um, let us reopen things and get kids back to normal. And there's a line that Jay Bhattacharya uses, that we have in the film, where he says, I came to Stanford as an 18-year-old. It's always been my home. I've been here, he was in his 50s at that point already. And he said the old motto of Stanford was let the winds of freedom blow. And in 2020, that fundamentally changed. And I think that line works for the United States as well. And globally, it wasn't just the United States, right? It was,
Right.
um,
I think
yeah.
I also think it's not an accident that the filmmaker you is from the former Soviet Union. Like it's not random that that happened. Which I want you to talk about in a second. I think it's also not random that most of the people that began to question everything that they saw during COVID were people who were, a lot of them were immigrants, actually, right? They were the ones who were like, something is going on here. Because we have kind of like a sixth sense about the role of the government. When the government wants to expand, we're it's a moment not just for pause, but for concern for many people who came from places where the government was so big, um, where the totalitarianism actually existed. I know you came to the United States as a small child, but connect that for me that the fact of the matter is you are from the former Soviet Union. You and I'm from the former Soviet Union. I didn't grow up there. Like I can't sit here and be like, I experienced the totalitarian regime. I didn't. I grew up in a free America. But something that my parents passed down so many stories to me. Do you have any of such stories? Do you have like I want to kind of highlight the fact that this film was made by someone that understands how precious freedom is.
Yeah, I mean, when I first came here in 1977, the push was for assimilation, right? I mean, first of all, my parents always valued this country and didn't complain a day, ever that I can remember about what they found here. And they didn't find, an easy life. We were living in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, and they both had to work full time. My father was a plumber. He's still thankfully alive, but retired. And he was working in incinerators and coming home, full covered in char and having apparently breathed asbestos for days and weeks and months on end, making, a couple of bucks an hour. But he felt like there was an opportunity for him here to really build a life for his family. My mother commuted to Manhattan from Brooklyn. It was a long commute. The subways weren't great. It was, during the Koch administration, there was no air conditioning, heating didn't work, everything was graffiti strewn. But again, no complaints, an opportunity to make her life, learn English, become as American as possible. And they sent me to public school. Then eventually they sent me to a Jewish school. And I was very fortunate to have an excellent education. And the more educated I became, later at a public high school and then at NYU undergrad, studying English and writing, the more disconnected I became from their stories and from their origin, from my origin too. They used to say, "You're a self-hating Russian." And I'd be like, "I'm not a Russian at all. Like, I'm American. Like, I listened to Michael Jackson. I was very into Motown. I just wanted to be rooted here." And I know that was the story for my friends as well. We were immigrants, but we didn't come to bring Russia here. We came to become American, and we did become American. And so, the stories that my parents told me were horrific. They were almost too much to process. I had to memory hold them, much as people are doing now with the school closures. And I hear that from parents every time we do a screening. Oh my God, that was so painful, but I'm glad I did this because I memory hold it. It was too traumatic. Um, but yeah, my father, both of my parents lost their fathers in World War II. They were fighting. They both got killed in action. So they were both raised by single mothers, and each with a sibling, and very, very difficult during World War II. My father was born in 1939. My mother was born in 1941, just outside of Odessa. And starvation, my father's mother was going blind. There was no medical treatment at the time. She had two young children, my father, who was about six, my late aunt, who was about eight. And my father, at six, him and his best friend went foraging like in other people's fields and were like stealing rotten apples and potatoes and bringing them home so that his mother, who was going blind, could, take the bad parts out, cook them, and including chicken as well. I remember hearing about chickens that they would bring home they were starving. My grandmother would cook them, and then she would go and sell it on the streets, and they would have like a little bit of the fat or some of the broth because they needed the money to survive. So I mean, these horrible stories that like it's very, very hard to relate to when you're like living in the land of, everything. Like we could go to ShopRite and have like shelves and shelves of everything. I had candy, I had soda, I had TV. It was all kind of like very antiquated, and I almost didn't want to hear about it anymore, but it was really important that it was shared with me. And so, while I may have memory hold it for a while, it did form who I am today and helped me process what was happening and gave me a sort of inoculation so that I could, speak up and try to protect this country that we came and we love.
I love that. I love that. Um, I was living in California, I want to tell you. I was living in California during school closure. Um, I don't think I memory hold it, as a lot of your maybe people that you speak with. Um, I remember, I remember a few things, but I will say one positive thing is that California is really beautiful, and where we lived was very outdoorsy, so we would take hikes all the time.
Mhm.
But, and this is something I don't think your film deals with. Your film deals with looking at the who and, like, as you said in the beginning, doing a forensic
Mhm.
kind of autopsy onto who benefited from these choices. Something that I noticed during the era or the time of COVID that really frightened me, Natalia, was the population, how people submitted, how
Mhm.
easily people believed, and how easily people see, once you generate hysteria, you could do so much,
Yeah.
to your point, right? What, as they said in that private Zoom, like we're sitting on gold, right?
Yeah.
Because when you create hysteria, it really is an amazing moment. And something I remember during 2020 was civil unrest riots on
Mhm.
the streets. And I remember thinking, well, that's strange because we're told not to be together, but we can be together if we're fighting an injustice. I remember that to me was like one of the first telltale signs, like the weather vanes, that the people who are telling us to stay home are also telling us to go on the streets and riot, and not riot, they didn't say riot, to go on the streets and march,
Protest. Yeah.
protest. And I remember thinking that to me was that kind of the weather vane that this is not America. This is an un-American thing. Now, I was not privy to all the things that you discovered in your film. I didn't see private Zoom meetings. I didn't get insider view, but I thought that that was very, it was like a double speak almost moment. But what frightened me and continues to frighten me is that you made this film and you're documenting what I say is like a moment of potential totalitarianism, of tyranny. Thank God it's five and I started this conversation. Why is this relevant 5.5 years later? To me, why this continues to be relevant is I worry about tyranny, obviously. I worry about excusing tyranny because if somebody's oppressed, then you can excuse their tyranny. But I worry about what I saw, I'm saying during COVID was people going along with illogical things.
Mhm.
For example, in California, people drive cars. People were driving cars alone with masks. That I was like, what? That was strange to me. No, and it wasn't just strange. It was, yes, it was illogical, but this is the hysteria. And that frightens me. How do we prepare then? How are we going to learn these lessons? This is my question to you. You've made this film because you want there to be a historical record. What are the things that you want parents? Because I think that we should, at the end of the day, you want to empower parents.
Mhm.
You're empowering parents.
Mhm.
What do you want parents to do more of?
Well, I want them to rely less on experts, and I want them to stop asking for information to be spoon-fed to them. We all feel like we're overwhelmed, and it's hard to triangulate, and we don't really read books anymore, and we live far away from our grandparents. Everybody's so disconnected. But I think there needs to be a concerted effort to come together in families and in communities and to really kind of start focusing on your immediate family, like having dinner with your kids. I mean, that's a really powerful thing. I mean, they've done research on this, like conversation at the dinner table where the kid tells you about what happened during their school day. That is not a waste of time. Like cooking dinner for your family and nourishing them with food and also stories. I mean, that's my parents were not experts at anything. Like there was nothing special going on in my house. I wasn't inoculated because they brought in like, some, guru. They
Color of
it was really just really basic, like the most basic things. Like we had dinner together and I would talk about my day and they would talk about, maybe sometimes they made me feel guilty because they talked about the fact that I had all these toys and I was still demanding more and they neither of them had grown up with any toys. Or my mother having to, I remember she talked about the fact that she was asked to be a bridesmaid, not a bridesmaid, a flower girl at a wedding, a neighbor's wedding when she was 5 or 6. And she didn't have anything to wear. So just like these, muslin cloths that somebody sewed together for her. And I was like just knowing that what we have is definitely a privilege and valuable, and also having those very, very strong relationships that begin in the home. I think are is extraordinarily inoculative. Also, I mean, in Europe, I know they used to talk about politics at the dinner table. They talked about history. They talked about poetry, civics. All of that's gone. Like we're all looking at these personal devices, and oftentimes, even the kids are looking at them at the dinner table. That has to stop. We need to kind of recenter the home, recenter the parent and the grandparent relationship. And I think then all of the stuff that happens in the schools, it'll be defanged. And outside the home. Outside of the home has to be outside. It can't be the center.
I think great. I think what you're saying it's so great, it's so on point is don't have the state or the school replace the family.
Definitely not. Moms for Liberty says we don't co-parent with the government. I'm with them.
Very good, yes. Um, what is the purpose of a school then, in your opinion?
God. I mean, I had great experiences at school. The basics, like teaching a child to be, a civilized person, social skills where they have to get along with peers that they may not like. I mean, I hear stories all the time from my kids and, their friends. Oh, this one is annoying. They have to figure out how to compromise and come together, or even just share respect for each other, even if they don't have the same viewpoints or may encroach on each other at times. But the basics: reading, writing, math, civics, science, socialization, sports. I mean, schools are really key for sports, especially public school athletics. Like that is a huge thing that was taken away during the pandemic. And many of the people we interviewed, the young men in New York City, the very young men that Randy Weingarten purported to be helping, the inner city black boys, they couldn't play sports. And even when school, because sports were shut down. By the way, parochial school sports were open, so Catholic schools could play in New York City. Private schools could play in New York City. And also, if you cross the border from New York City into Westchester, those kids in public schools could play too. The New York City kids were locked out of sports. Why? What happened when sports reopened? They had vaccine mandates. The Black community historically was very distrustful of vaccines because we know that the legacy of this country and experimentation, it's right to be distrustful. And now you were telling them that their children had to get vaccinated with a new experimental vaccine in order to go back to normal. How is that protecting the vulnerable? That kind of stuff. But going back to all of this, I think sports are absolutely critical. And I think sports are also incredibly protective against a lot of these ideologies because when these kids play sports, especially team sports, they have coaches. Yes, you can't account for like a good coach or a bad coach, but I think in general, the coaches I had come across while we were advocating for reopening schools were great, like blue collar type salt of the earth people who really loved kids and wanted to see their teams succeed and have these kids be, vital members of society. So I think, home and sports are two of the most important things.
Wow, that's great. Love that answer. As we are getting to the hour, a few last questions. Oh, how has the response been, reception to the film? Have you gotten any? Obviously, you've gotten great rave reviews. I've read many of them. The fact that you got 1 million people, you decided to premiere on X, and I remember you got like in the first night almost, I don't know, like 800,000, if not right, 1 million people.
A little less. It took about a month. Yeah.
Okay, but the fact of the matter is, it is getting around. What has been some? Did you have you? What have you? What are your responses to the film?
Oh, that I'm hearing from people everywhere. I think, we premiered it in person at Moms for Liberty at their annual summit, which just happened a few weeks ago in Orlando, Florida. And there were a lot of tears. This is a self-selecting audience, right? These are like the most vocal, dedicated parent volunteers who come from all over the country, but it's a good sample of those amazing parents, moms and dads. And a lot of tears, um, a lot of, oh my God, I forgot that that happened. I just completely like, sutured it up and you brought it back. And this reminds me of how important it is to, assert our, parenthood and our authority with our children and with the schools and what they did, they're still doing. Like we see this stuff. It just kind of recharged and reinvigorated them. That's mostly what I've been hearing all around. People who say, I forgot, thanks for helping me remember.
Has Randy Weingarten responded? Has she? No.
No. No, and I asked her for an interview. I mean, after she and I met, we kept in touch for a little while. And I did text her and said I was making this film. This was probably back in 22 or 23, I don't know. And she said that they would get back to us about an interview, but they never did.
Right.
And she
Right.
does have a great new book out. Why, what is it? Why Fascists Fear Teachers. She's still at it.
Yeah. Well, I think I saw that. What is new for you? What's your next? Do you have any new projects coming up you want to share with us?
Yes, I'm working on a short film about Maud Marin, who is a real hero here in New York City and nationally. I think she's been known as the mom who just wouldn't wouldn't back down. Like she's uncancelable. She was one of the open schools moms here in New York City who spoke out about the school closures and then later about masking. And now she's kind of made a name for herself by speaking out about boys playing in girls' sports. And so that's kind of created a lot of controversy here in New York City where boys are playing in girls' sports, and even a resolution to reconsider the wisdom of allowing boys who identify as girls in girls' sports. It has been like like a big riot in community school board meetings. Anyway, I'm making a short film about her and about her bid for Manhattan DA. She ran and unfortunately just lost a couple of weeks ago, and Alvin Bragg, the Soros-backed DA, won by a huge landslide as expected.
And what is your hope in making a film about her? What is the hope that you try to, what awareness are you trying to bring?
I hope that her story of a very special, I mean, she's a good friend of mine and I care about her deeply, but she is just an average person who's a public school parent who didn't have to speak out and didn't have to put herself on the line repeatedly. That story of somebody who just naturally did the right thing and didn't back down and kowtow to name calling will inspire other people to use their voice and not allow others to cancel them.
I love that. I think that your film, what I'm hearing you saying is that through your films, you're reinvigorating and you're trying to give people power to them, give power to the people. So American. I love it.
Or
Um,
remind them that they do have the power, right? I mean, we keep hearing about the anti-heroes like Randy Weingarten. We need more Maud Marins.
I love that. Um, you also are co-founder of Restore Childhood. What are you working on through there? What kind
Um,
of
there's, there's another film that we're developing about another hero story because I think that, when I grew up, I was watching 1980s movies where like there was the song was an anthem. It was, what a feeling. This girl who was a welder who became like a ballerina, or what's the other one? Fame, where, the great music, hero stories that made me feel like, okay, even though I'm nothing now, one day I can be like the kids in Fame. They weren't special either, And so I think that there are enough people doing really good things that we need to be um, watching them, showing them to our children, making sure that they are the household names so that we have many, many more heroes.
Beautifully said. And this Monday, just to reiterate, your film is going to be shown at the Manhattan Institute, and you'll be there.
Yeah, it's at the Look Cinemas. I will definitely be there. And the journalist John Tierney, who I've long respected, he used to write for the New York Times, and he's a fellow at Manhattan Institute and writes for City Journal. He's going to moderate a panel with me and several of the others in the film.
Wow, excellent. And where else can people find the film online?
It's online for now on X at Restore Childhood, but it will be streaming on the major platforms within about a month.
Amazing. That's so cool. That's so cool. Well, thanks so much for joining. Don't know much about. I'm really, really honored to speak to you, just as a fellow person who cares so much about this country. And I do a lot, as you know, I write a lot about, I talk a lot about the threat of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I think that this film, these are bedfellows in many ways. I wrote about this years and years ago. There were something people who were engaging in anti-American libels and anti-American slurs ended up also there was a kind of a I don't know, causation or correlation, but conflation, or not conflation, but there was a similar tendency of people engaging with anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic slurs and libels. And you could almost say that if a person believes certain things about society, whether a government should be bigger or smaller, the role that schools should play in teaching people to have empathy, for instance, you can predict pretty much where they stand on anti-Zionism and whether they're going to be okay bringing anti-Zionism into curriculum. So I really want to thank you for sharing your wisdom. I think you're a hero as well. Like, you're just a regular mom, but you're made this film, you're making another film. So thank you so much for joining. Until next time, thank you so much, and wait until this episode drops soon.
Don't know much about history.